Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Improving Restorations webinar series. My name is Gina Quirum, and I'm going to be getting us started this morning. Today's topic is the ongoing challenge of buckthorn. This is a topic that previous webinar attendees have requested some helpful information on, so we're going to be bringing that to you today. We have two speakers lined up for you today. The first is Michael Schuster. Michael is a researcher with the Department of, Michael is a researcher with the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. His research broadly focuses on the ecology and management of invasive plant species. Mike is currently one of the lead scientists on the Cover It Up program, which evaluates how land managers can use native plant species to reduce invasion by buckthorn and other species in Minnesota forests. Michael is going to be giving us an update on his research today. Our second speaker is Nicholas Snavely. Nicholas is with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and has overseen multiple buckthorn control projects carried out by the agency, by staff and contractors on state wildlife management areas, in collaboration with conservation partners like Great River Greening, the Nature Conservancy, and Wildlife Forever, who have also been able to use conservation legacy partner funding grants and other outdoor heritage funding to provide buckthorn control and technical guidance in private and public lands, including St. Cloud State University, the City of St. Cloud, Stearns County Parks, and Clearview Elementary School forests. This is all done in an effort to assist them in restoring, enhancing, and maintaining forests, oak savanna, prairie, and wetland habitats that they manage. Nicholas is going to be talking to us today about his experience over the arc of his career. Throughout the webinar, we welcome you to submit your questions for the speaker. After the two speakers, we'll have 20 minutes for question and answer. You can use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. Ask the questions in that box, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. The Q&A icon is located at the bottom of your screen for you to type in the questions. Use the chat feature if you're having any technical challenges or for general discussion. After the presentation, you'll receive a short survey that will pop up in your browser. This survey will better help us to serve you in the future and know what topics people want to learn more about in future webinars. If you've missed something or want to share this webinar with anyone, a recording will be available in a few days after the webinar on the website where you registered. We have one more webinar remaining in this series, and that will be 2 weeks from today, where we'll hear an update on the Minnesota State seed mixes and the recipe they provide for success. This webinar is being brought to you in cooperation between the University of Minnesota Extension and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the Board of Water and Soil Resources Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. If you want to learn more about opportunities with the University of Minnesota Extension, ecological restoration certificates are available, and you can learn more and register at this website. And you can learn more about the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program on our website, where we have recommendations from our panel on improving restorations. We collaborate with experts to evaluate restorations that are happening around the state, identify what's working and where there are ongoing challenges, and share this information to support project partners in improving future restorations. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and invite Michael to share his screen.
And be sure to unmute, Mike. There you go.
Yeah. I mean, I can give the whole talk muted, but probably won't be as good. Or maybe, hopefully, it wouldn't be as good, right? Right. So thanks. Yeah, I'm Mike Schuster. I'm a researcher at the University of Minnesota. And today I'm going to share some work that I've done with Peter Ragg and Peter Reich there on how we might be able to use plants to help control buckthorn. In general, that work has shown that establishing native plant species after buckthorn removal can reduce the amount of buckthorn returning over multiple years. More specifically, seeding grasses and wildflowers in sites that have ample light availability can slow the growth of new and existing buckthorn, and then planting shrubs and trees that keep their leaves late into fall can consistently suppress or even eliminate buckthorn in a wider diversity of sites. So if you're here, you are probably experienced or at least interested in buckthorn removal. And so you may know that there's a bunch of different ways that we can do that, ranging from things like forestry mowing that you see here. That's basically a big shredder on the front of a bobcat that you go and mulch down trees, to using goats to go through and eat a bunch of plants, or using a variety of herbicides with a bunch of different application techniques and approaches, or even using prescribed burns in some cases. Regardless of which of those tools or approaches we use, you may have noticed buckthorn has a tendency to come back. And that's a pretty common thing. We do a removal and then boom, buckthorn's still there. And you're like, what did I just spend all that time doing? And that's the case here in one of our experimental sites too. So we forestry mowed this site. And then a year or two later, it looked like this, where all the buckthorn had come back. They're 6 feet tall and totally dominating the site. And so what this means is that instead of progressing through a process of identifying an invasion, removing that invader, and then restoring the system, we are often pushed back into this loop of invasion and removal, right? We're never able to actually move all the way through into achieving our restoration goals because we're constantly battling this resurgence of the invader, in this case, buckthorn, making buckthorn removal much more an issue of maintenance than actual restoration in the long run. Part of the reason for this is that by removing buckthorn, we're actually increasing light availability. Think about a forest that's dominated by buckthorn. That buckthorn layer is intercepting or blocking a lot of light that would otherwise make it to the soil surface and feed other plants. And so if you look at this site here, again, this is one that's been forestry mowed. In the back, you can see a bunch of buckthorn, a really thick invasion. In the front, we've mowed that all down. And so there's very different light environments between the background and the foreground here. Often that corresponds to at least a 10-fold difference in light availability. So in the background here, it's about 2% on average. And then in the foreground, it's generally more than 20%. In this picture, it's way more than 20%. And so there's a really big difference in light availability. We know that that difference is critical based on some earlier work that we've done. So this is the probability of any given buckthorn seedling surviving over time. And then on the bottom of this graph, we have canopy openness. And what we found was that at about 3% canopy openness or lower, buckthorn can't survive, meaning that in this environment here, where there's lots of buckthorn in the background, new buckthorn have a really hard time. But when we open that canopy up, we pass that threshold. We move into a light environment that's much more favorable to them. In fact, we found that going from 3 to 10% light availability rapidly improves buckthorn survival. Then above 10% light availability, there's still gains in buckthorn survival, but it tends to taper off at about 20%. So a massive difference from the perspective of a new buckthorn in terms of the resources available to it before and after removal. Essentially, this means that removing buckthorn primes the community for reinvasion. Again, consider this environment here. On the right, we have a picture of a site where on the left, we've removed buckthorn by hand cutting, and on the right, we've left the buckthorn intact. And those two different conditions offer very different levels of resource availability, both in terms of light, but potentially other resources too, like soil nutrients or water. And all these extra nutrients, resources that are available in the removed area can be easily exploited by buckthorn returning to the site in the form of resprouts from cut stumps or new buckthorn sprouting from the seed bank. After years of invasion, there's seed from buckthorn trees built up in the soil, and they are just waiting for their chance to take over. By removing that overstory component of buckthorn, we're giving them that chance, so they take it. In contrast, there can be very little native species left in the seed bank. And so they don't have the same opportunity to exploit that surge in resource availability that the buckthorn does. Can my computer keep up with us? Okay, great. It wouldn't be a webinar if something didn't go wrong. All right, so basically what this means is that we've shifted the community from one that would suppress new buckthorn into one that allows for their rapid proliferation. Right? By increasing light availability, we're providing them with that surge of resource availability. And so part of the issue here is an abundance of resources and a lack of competition. Perhaps there's a way we can reintroduce species in a way that offers competition to buckthorn. And so we can do that by planting them or by seeding them in. And this is something that people do all the time in grasslands. It's well studied, well practiced in grassland. It's a common part of grassland restoration. But in forests, it's less commonly done and even less studied. When it is done in forests, it's often done for other benefits, like providing erosion control or providing fuel for prescribed burns, increasing biodiversity directly, or providing habitat for wildlife. But look at this scenario here. Here's me standing on the left in an area that hasn't been seeded, in an area on the right that has been seeded. You might expect here too to see very different competitive environments, right? So, of course, reseeding or revegetating a site can increase competition as well. And so perhaps by revegetating a site, by introducing native plants back in, we can reverse this trend of increasing light availability by moving a site to one that has ample light, ample resources, into one that has few extra resources available, and one that actually has so few resources not used that buckthorn is suppressed or excluded. So the general idea here is that if we revegetate, we can offer competition and soak up resources that buckthorn are then unable to use. The challenge is that it's not just about competition in the middle of summer. It's not just about competition in general. It's about competition in a particular time of the year. So buckthorn has this really cool ability to hold on to its leaves longer than most other native species. Like if we look outside right now, most of the green stuff that you see growing in the understory is buckthorn, right? So it's not uncommon to see buckthorn with green leaves amongst snow. Generally, it won't lose its leaves until they're frozen off. And buckthorn utilizes that ability to gain carbon to do photosynthesis at the end of the growing season at a time that other plants aren't active. And that extra carbon that it gets through that process is critical to its survival. We showed that in an earlier experiment too here, where on the y-axis of these graphs, on the vertical axis, we have the probability of survival, and on the horizontal axis, we have light availability. Here in the middle for summer and for fall. You'll notice that the summer light availability doesn't really make a difference to buckthorn. Buckthorn doesn't necessarily care how much light is available in the middle of summer, but it does care quite a bit about how much light is available in fall. This suggests that fall light availability is essential for buckthorn survival. And so if we want to revegetate and suppress buckthorn, we need to target that fall light capture. We need to plant in species that are going to minimize buckthorn's ability to perform photosynthesis at the end of the growing season. And so we continued to do a bunch of different experiments, and we asked, how does buckthorn regeneration respond to revegetation? And we did this using a variety of revegetation options, reflecting a gradient of competitive ability and manager investment. So some of them are really strong competitors that require a lot of effort. Some of these treatments are less competitive, but also require less investment on a land manager's behalf. The first experiment I want to tell you about is this small plot experiment. So we're using 1.2 by 1.2 meter plots, just a few feet in either direction, and we planted them with a variety of different revegetation treatments, including an herbaceous seed mixture, plugs of Pennsylvania sedge, or bare roots mixtures of different shrubs, including 2 different elderberry species, a hazel and a dogwood, or a tree mixture comprised of either maple or fir. And we did this at 3 sites around the Twin Cities that had all undergone buckthorn removal directly beforehand. And the most responsive metric we observed was what we're going to call cumulative buckthorn growth. This is just like a generalized metric of buckthorn invasion. The way that we measured it was that we looked at the number of buckthorn popping up in 2017, then monitored those buckthorn over time through 2020. And we then calculated this metric by expressing the total amount of buckthorn mass, like the size of those buckthorn, relative to that starting number of buckthorn seedlings. So we took the mass in 2020 and divided by the number of seedlings in 2017, giving us, again, this generalized metric of invasion. If you had a lot of buckthorn that persisted in the plot, or those buckthorn that did exist were really large, that would give you a high cumulative buckthorn growth. But if you had very few surviving or very small buckthorn, that would give you a low cumulative buckthorn growth. And this is what we found. So here is that generalized metric of invasion on the y-axis, and then our different treatments down below. If we looked at our tree treatment, which again is sugar maple and fir, you can see here, that reduced buckthorn invasion by about 81%, a pretty good number. But it got even better when we planted shrubs. Shrubs reduced invasion by 89% relative to an unplanted control. And so we saw really strong suppressive abilities of trees and shrubs on average. And that's because both of these treatments are able to soak up fall light. They're able to offer that competition in the fall when other treatments aren't necessarily able to do that as well. So we saw that tree shading in the fall was largely a combination of sugar maple and fir, right? Those were the 2 species that we planted there. The fir was less productive. It didn't grow as quickly as the sugar maple did, but it kind of formed its own layer down below, and that layer is evergreen. The maple grew taller, grew faster, but was deciduous. And so we had kind of the stratification within these plots where down low we have that evergreen layer, kind of keeps things down low. And then we have this higher layer that offers that extra shading, but not throughout the entirety of the season. And they make a really good team in that way. They can kind of divide and conquer the light coming into the plot through these different growth strategies. In contrast, the shrub plots were dominated exclusively by elderberry, generally red elderberry, sometimes common elderberry, but an elderberry nonetheless. The dogwood, the hazel weren't major components in these plots. And so when we look at the shrub data, it's really indicative of how the elderberry performed. And elderberry is super productive and has that extended phenology. It has its leaves late into fall, just like buckthorn does. And oftentimes won't lose its leaves fully until they're frozen off, just like buckthorn. So we can see elderberry offering that direct competition in that critical time window. And so we think this is good evidence for either of these approaches being strong candidates for revegetation. In fact, we saw that either our tree treatment or our shrub treatment completely excluded buckthorn after a 3-year period in the majority of plots, right? We said there's 81%, 89% reduction in invasion, but that's on average. When we actually look at the numbers, we see that in the majority of our experimental plots, these treatments just completely remove buckthorn. So in 11 of the 18 tree plots, there were no buckthorn remaining after 3 years. And in 12 of the 18 shrub plots, there were no buckthorn remaining after 3 years. And this is particularly true in the darkest sites. So this is buckthorn survival per number of seeds relative to canopy openness. So how light or dark the canopy is at that site. And you can see in these darkest sites, the purple line here and the green line here are the tree and shrub plots. We're basically approaching zero survivability in these darkest plots over 3 years. So trees and shrubs seem to do really well in this context. What about the other treatments? Okay, there we go. So sedges reduce buckthorn invasion by about 66%, but then seeding on its own reduced invasion by 51%. So basically cut it in half. And this is what that type of seeding looks like. Right? So it's not as tall, not as thick as the tree or shrub plots, but still, pretty productive. And this matches up really well with some similar impacts that we've seen in seeding in our other experiments. So in 2016, we did a survey of 46 different management units around the Twin Cities where buckthorn had been removed at some point in the past 5 years. And we looked at the recovery of those sites depending on how those sites were removed and then treated. And we found that seeding, plots that had been seeded, generally tended to have half of the buckthorn than plots that were not seeded. So again, about that 50% reduction just with seeding in these real world environments. We also did a larger, more well replicated study using seeding. So we did an experiment here using a seed mixture with 35 different species. Largely, that mixture was weighted towards wild rye species, so limus species, but it also had 22 different forbs in it, including things like snakeroot and Rudbeckia species. And we seeded it really heavily in 2017 and then hit it again with another round of just wild ryegrass in 2018. And we looked at how this seeding affected buckthorn recovery, both in the presence and absence of an herbicide treatment. So our herbicide treatment, we use phosphamine ammonium, which is a bud inhibitor herbicide. We applied that at the end of August of 2017 using backpacks and pistol grip high volume sprayers. And this is what we found. So here is total buckthorn height relative to 2017. So basically looking at the growth of buckthorn in these plots relative to their 2017 starting point. And what we saw was that if we didn't seed and didn't herbicide, buckthorn just took off, right? Like that's not a surprising result that if you don't do anything, buckthorn grows really fast. However, when we seeded in these plots without herbicide, we still saw some reduction in buckthorn growth. But where we really saw the most benefit was when we used herbicide in conjunction with seeding. So when we herbicided, that killed a bunch of buckthorn, of course. And immediately after that, in the absence of seeding, this black line here, we saw buckthorn start to bounce back right away, right? So we herbicided, buckthorn started to bounce back. After that, though, if we seeded, we saw that buckthorn abundance continued to decline or stabilize in a way that by that third year, we saw 40% less buckthorn in seeded plots relative to unseeded plots in the context of herbicide application on average. So again, kind of fitting in this halving of buckthorn with the use of herbaceous seed. If we split that average up and look at how site characteristics influence this pattern, we saw that seeding was much more effective in brighter sites. So again, here is buckthorn survival relative to the number of seeds, and here is canopy openness on the bottom, and the green line is the seeded plots relative to unseeded plots in black here. You'll notice that when we get to really dark sites, there's not much impact of seeding, but in the brightest sites, there's quite a large difference between seeded and unseeded plots in terms of buckthorn survival. So for instance, here at about 20% canopy openness, we saw a 70% reduction in buckthorn survival. Right? So for reference, this is a hemispherical photo that shows what about 20% openness looks like. In a little bit darker site, something like 7% openness, again, photo for reference, you can see that we got about a 33% decrease in buckthorn survival. Right? And so these more open environments have better results with seeding. So in conclusion, we saw that follow-up removal of existing buckthorn was needed, right? That you need to have that herbicide treatment in order to knock out those resprouts, even with revegetation, right? If we don't control those resprouts, for example, they'll take over. But if we can knock those back, then we have a chance. Right? Revegetation can slow the growth of existing buckthorn and prevent new buckthorn from growing. But which method we use, seeding versus planting, depends on the site. If a site is really bright, we'll have the greatest value, greatest result using an herbaceous seed mixture. But if the site is dark, then we'll have much better results using trees or shrubs. And so we saw that herbaceous seeding can best suppress buckthorn regeneration in lighter sites, generally things that had more than 10% canopy openness, whereas shrubs and trees can suppress buckthorn across a great variety of sites, right? We saw that trees and shrubs did well everywhere, but they did especially well in those darker sites that are less than 10% canopy openness. Ultimately, our results suggest that revegetating forests after buckthorn removal could lead to less buckthorn. Right? That sounds like a win. And with less buckthorn means reduced herbicide and labor costs for removal, right? We don't have to necessarily do as much work to keep that invasion in check. It means improved biodiversity and ecosystem function. We have a healthier native ecosystem as opposed to one that's invaded and constantly under management disturbance. And then ultimately, this leads to enhanced value of Minnesota forests, both for nature and for us as humans. So thanks. If you have questions that we aren't able to get to today, I want to point you to our email address covered up at umn.edu is our project email. We also have a website. And then this project also wouldn't be possible without a really healthy list of supporters and partners at our various sites. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And with that, I think we'll turn it right over to Nick to have him share some of his practitioner perspective. Keep your questions coming in the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many of them as we can.
Right, I am ready. If you can allow me to share my video. Or am I? Yeah. Mhm. So welcome everyone. My name is Nicholas Snavely. You should be able to see my screen now, and hopefully everything will come up. It should.
Yep, we can see your screen.
Perfect. So I work with the DNR based out of St. Cloud, Sauk Rapids area. I cover Sherburne, Stearns, and Wright County. So thanks for the earlier introduction. The previous presenter. It's great to see some research on the ground on buckthorn. It's critically important. Today we're going to talk a little bit about buckthorn on a practical land manager perspective, even probably from a private landowner's perspective as well. You know, understanding what what to consider and what I've seen on the ground, different trials and tribulations to try to make buckthorn control actually work. And I've come to this topic today because I found that you know, this previous presentation talked about planting some alternative native shrubs in place of buckthorn to shade it out, and I think that's a great idea. Also looking at more of the standard practices today, I wanted to make those aware of you. So what are those? One of the things that I've found is, you know, before you start anything, you really need to know what's out there. Common or glossy buckthorn. And of course, there's some other similar natives, such as honeysuckle and what have you, that people typically see when they go look for buckthorn. But getting that identified and reported through whatever tools that you might use with the agency you work for. And then what can you do? Hand pulling is one option that was discussed earlier. You can cut it with hand tools, but maybe a loppers or a hand saw. And then typically when something is cut, you want to get herbicides on it as quickly as possible. You know, that could be a dabber stick to, you know, treat the cut stump. You could even not even cut the stump. You could put a basal bark herbicide application of a chemical like Garlon 4 Ultra, an oil-based solution that could be applied during the wintertime below frozen conditions. Or you can just do a foliar spot spray, say for resprouts of cut stems or something that was mowed previously, or even seedlings that came up over the next 5 years, because that seed viability is present for at least 5 years, assuming no other bird brings in another seed from a neighboring area and drops it onto the landscape you're trying to manage. And then, of course, the bigger tools for maybe more dense areas of buckthorn that are brought in are heavy equipment, so, you know, to remove brush and tree removal. So we're talking things like skid steers with mowers in the front of them, or even tractors, and I'll show a picture of that. Or you can even have a tree shear if you have big enough buckthorn. That may or may not be a successful tool. We found in our work area that if the buckthorn is too small, it just isn't going to work. It might work for pinching it and pulling it out of the ground completely, but you're going to have a lot of soil disturbance, which might be creating more conditions for buckthorn to sprout in that area more easily. Grazing using goats or with or without sheep is a tool that we've used in our work area. And then even long-term, you know, grazing, prescribed fire, I would consider long-term options if you can get enough of the buckthorn out initially to use those tools. And buckthorn seedlings, you know, this whole the discussion about shade competition through forest underplanting of native brush and grass forbs or sedges. And the reason I say grass forbs or sedges, if you're working in an oak savanna habitat, you may not want a forest understory of, say, elderberry or what have you, dominating that understory. You might want something more grass or forb flowers dominate, or sedges. And then when you do take buckthorn, you control it. Are you letting it stand by just treating it with a basal bark treatment and just letting it fall apart over time and die? Or are you going through the extra labor and work to pile it and burn it, or potentially haul it away? And those obviously come with a cost. And then I think most of us know at this point, over 11 years of research, biocontrol still does not seem to be a viable option at this time, unfortunately. So we're having to rely on mechanical and chemical means to try to handle buckthorn control. So, you know, throughout the woods, you might see it as a private landowner or as a land manager. This is one of the best times of the year to actually see it so present on the understory of the landscape. Most of the trees have lost most of their leaves, or if they haven't, they've turned yellow or orange or red, and that buckthorn green leaves are still present. Green is all get out, and you can really notice them. So the DNR has resources out there that you can go to if you're so interested and haven't checked them out already. As shown here, buckthorn control and what you should know. So, but okay, taking a step back, you look at the landscape of Minnesota, because that's what we're focused on today, buckthorn in Minnesota. We have three main ecotypes: the forest, the transition zone, and the prairie that once existed before it was largely converted to agricultural crops. My work area falls in this hardwood transition zone of the state that's been impacted through development, encroachment, various other fragmentation, as shown in this photo. And so managing buckthorn on one piece of land may be fairly difficult when you consider you have a neighbor nearby that may or may not be treating it. So a collaboration with neighbors is always appreciated to tackle a project like buckthorn control. And habitat complexes that have wetland edges that will have buckthorn before up into upland areas. You got forests that will have buckthorn. Even in open prairies, you will see buckthorn start to invade if it's potentially wet enough. And so our native wildlife, such as deer, occupy these edge habitats where you typically will start to see buckthorn really thrive. Even turkeys for that matter. This picture here, you can imagine this being full of buckthorn, and trying to get this back to a state that kind of is shown here in this picture would be the end goal for the species that we're managing habitat for. This prairie ecosystem, it has shrubs that are native, but it can easily be encroached upon. We've seen this on our partners WMA. And then edge habitat, like I mentioned before. Woody encroachment is just natural for native growth, but it also can occur to non-native species such as buckthorn. So what do? We can mow it down to keep brush at bay, but we also do the same thing for buckthorn. And we can even go as far as, for other woody species, tree shears, and even bigger buckthorn we can as well. So in St. Cloud, Tualahi Woods did a restoration project looking at trying to remove buckthorn. They came in with a big piece of machinery with low impact tires on the landscape and essentially mowed it all down. That was a way of dealing with a high dense area of buckthorn and trying to get it to a state where they can potentially do the next step. The downfall of this approach, though, is as you can see, there's many shattered stems, and getting a follow-up herbicide treatment on these stems is in some regards almost impossible to be effective, and the stems themselves are shattered, and they might not take up the herbicide as well as, say, a cut stem that's flush a couple inches off the ground. And we look at Tualahi Woods a couple years down the road. You got an area that was once full of buckthorn on the left or other native species, and was opened up with this forestry mowing technique during the fall time or even in the winter. Winter is the technique that's typically used more often than not for going into these areas because they don't want to infect the soils. So here's another area that shows buckthorn. This area was treated with the forestry mowing technique, but it came back the next year very strong with resprouts because there was not an effective treatment of follow-up herbicides in that area. And so they had to come back and essentially do a foliar spray of resprouts. And the timing is always critical. It might look green, but it might not take up the herbicides. And so this is an example of an area that was treated maybe a couple days prior to a winter storm. But in the end, a follow-up look at that area showed that it was not as effective as they had hoped. So they'll have to do another treatment again this last fall to treat the areas that were missed or did not get treated effectively. And that really gets into when you do contracting with vendors, if you're a land manager, having good performance-based contracts that you can even have holdbacks in your language of your contract that you write up to make sure that the buckthorn is treated properly at the right time of year. Because if it isn't, you're going to have funding source that might be only good for 3 years. And once you run out of that money, what do? You know, it's usually good for the initial treatment, but sometimes getting that funding again in the future for that same piece of land, especially on state land, can be very difficult based on your funding sources. I've seen that to be more often than not the case. And it's a struggle for a land manager that can't continue to get additional funding to go in and do some of the long-term treatment or follow-up spot treatments that might be needed. So this is what an area looks like. You know, it may or may not have been effective. In this case, this area did take up some herbicide to the left of the picture, but when they switched a little bit later, a date later to do the area to the right, it had to come back and redo that area. So what are we missing on the landscape? You know, we're missing our large megafauna. Especially in central Minnesota, we might have an elk roaming from the northern part of the state, very few and far between, but they do happen from time to time. You know, we don't have moose in this part of the state anymore, and we've pretty much extirpated bison from the landscape as well. So grazing essentially is going to have to be replaced by something that's more domestic, such as goats and sheep. In this example, at Christopher Carrillo WMA, near New Munich, Minnesota, has 3 paddocks that we did conservation grazing, or trying to not only just go through and mow it all down, which we did in this oak savanna understory, but we followed up the treatment with grazing of goats. And so we brought goats in, and they're great. They go after broadleafs fairly well, but if you really want to get them to focus on those broadleaf buckthorn plants, bringing in sheep with them and getting them in the density that you need to really make a quick impact upon those areas is really important. And so this is an example of this past summer where we did 2 passes at Tualahi Woods. Before and after pictures of the browse that occurred out there. And then of course we had regrowth. The buckthorn did come back again. And these are, a lot of these pictures show some resprouts from areas that were mowed. So it's a struggle to try to get these areas under control if they're not treated with herbicides that you might have had more effective treatments, say through a cut stum or just a basal bark treatment, and left everything stand. But in this case, our goal was to try to get rid of the overstory, follow up with some grazing techniques, and then hopefully try to get our native grasses and forbs to revegetate this area so that we can someday carry a prescribed fire through the understory. This is our second round of grazing here, shown in this pictures as well. And being diligent to go out there and check the contractor's work to make sure you get the habitat effects that you're looking for to knock back that buckthorn is critically important. If you're not checking to make sure they have enough goats or sheep out there to put the pressure on, they might not be completely reducing that buckthorn to the point where it's hopefully exhausting some of the nutrients that are going into the ground in the fall time. We will have one more spring treatment in this area, but it's still up in the air whether or not, in this case, grazing with goats is going to work. And so we might have to come back with a follow-up treatment of herbicides again. We've done buckthorn treatment in other areas. This is one of my first areas I brought in Great River Green with a contractor, and we identified first off, what do we have out there for buckthorn? Is it high intensity or high density? Is it low density spotty, or even medium? And the reason that's important is because if it's medium or low, you might be better off just going in with a basal bark treatment, let it stand, and don't mow it down, because once you start mowing it, you're going to have resprouts if you can't get good herbicide uptake on those plants. I've come to the point now where I'm starting to question even high density areas, whether or not we should be mowing them down. Is that really the most effective method? Or should we truly be putting more time into on the ground, boots on the ground, essentially basal barking everything? The only problem with that, of course, is buckthorn is very pokey, and you need good eyewear and safety wear to get through a stand like that. But I'd rather see it dead first before I decide to mow it down a year later, versus mowing it down and then seeing it all resprout and have to deal with it year on and year out. So really rethinking whether or not this idea of mowing it first is the most appropriate method. Logistically, it might be quick and easy, but long-term, is it really effective? And of course, we want to get prescribed fire back in the landscape and the habitats that are fire dependent. So here we have wetlands and uplands that might have buckthorn encroachment potentially, and reintroducing fire into that landscape on a irregular interval to keep buckthorn seedlings at bay, or even resprouts if we can get the vegetative cover in an oak understory. That's what we're looking for, because we need long-term tools. We can't just go in for the first 3 years, use some grant money, and expect it's all good after that. There's going to need to be some long-term management, either through grazing, fire, you name it. We need to continue to keep on top of these habitats so they don't reinvest or have the issues that we have where buckthorn just comes back. So I put that question out, and I think we'll probably turn it over to the moderators, but one of the main ones they wanted me to start out with was, what buckthorn control strategies are others find effective long-term? And the reason I asked that question is about, what I've seen out there. And I've kind of alluded to those, but at this point I will stop talking and maybe open up for the question and answer period.
Thank you, Michael and Nicholas, for your great presentations. We appreciate your time today. So we do have a lot of questions. We anticipated that we would from our audience. And I'll start with, there were a couple of questions I think that were related to herbicide rate. So I'm going to start with Michael for that. What, in your research experiments, what were the herbicide rates, and then how often did you have to do a treatment prior to either any of your planting or seeding work? And please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So for phosphate ammonium, we use Krenite is the brand name. We did 100 liters per hectare on average, and that was of a 7% solution. In both the seeding, the large seeding experiment and the smaller planting experiment, that was done once in late August of 2017. So directly following buckthorn removal. And then in the case of the planting experiment, because these were so small plots, we didn't want to get in there with herbicide. So we just kind of stayed on top of those small plots by hand. But the larger plots, the seeded plots, didn't have any additional curation over that experimental period. So between 2017 and 2020, there was no additional herbicide. However, in the past year or two, we've done some very minor spot spraying in those plots, just to basically tidy things up. But the good news is, with that reduction in buckthorn abundance provided to us by the seeding, that's relative to what it would be a trivial task. There's little enough buckthorn in those plots on average that it's really easy to just go in there with a backpack sprayer and hit the few plants that you need to hit.
And Nicholas, can you address, when you were doing the forestry mowing, did you anticipate that you would have to do a foliar herbicide application after the forestry mowing?
Yeah, so that was actually a project I helped someone else, the city of St. Cloud, and at that time St. Cloud State University with. So Great River Green contracted out with a vendor to take care of that treatment. There's always, I think, a need to follow up with a herbicide treatment. And I think that was known. It's just, when are you timing that to occur? If you're going to be doing a winter mowing, and you're going to have shattered stems all over the place, are you having someone come in right behind that heavy equipment that's throwing shards of tree branches all over the place and getting in there within the next hour and treating that? Or is that even effective with the shattered stem? It might not actually be. And, in this case, I believe the vendor was going to come back in the next spring and spray those stumps as they resprouted. Looking back, I don't know that that would be the approach I would like to take. But to be honest with you, more often than not, that seems to be the going first treatment, is to get that dense area of buckthorn to the ground and then open it up so at least you could get in there and work on it. But I'm really rethinking that myself as a land practitioner.
Are those foliar applications typically more effective in fall versus spring? Is there any
Yes.
research to that effect?
Right. So we have two different type of herbicides, mainly that have an active ingredient that we're working woody species, and it really depends if you're using an oil or water-based solution. If it's above freezing, you can go with the water-based solution, kind of like a Garland 3A versus oil-based solution that might be Garland 4 Ultra. And there's other brand names of that as well. So the active ingredient, but that is found in those chemicals. But the fall is the time when buckthorn is probably easiest to easily see in the woods. You can walk right now this time of year. You can walk through the woods and you can see buckthorn stick out as like a sore thumb. You can also see it probably in early spring, to be honest with you, because it's one of the first things that greens up in this early spring and does compete with our forest 4 early spring plants as well. So there's 2 times to do it, but typically when you're trying to do woody control, it's usually that fall time when the plants are putting their nutrient reserves back into the roots that you want to try to hit it. You have that uptake of chemical at the same time.
And Michael, I'm going to turn back to you. Could some of the techniques that you developed with seeding and planting to suppress buckthorn also be applied to other invasive shrubs such as non-native honeysuckles, not choked hair? I'm thinking of Japanese barberry, things like that.
Yeah. So one of the optimistic portion, yeah, certainly one of the optimistic portions of our approach is that, buckthorn is generally more shade tolerant than a lot of these species. So if we are able to shade out buckthorn, that probably means that we can shade out these other species. The complication would arise when dealing with species that spread vegetatively, since they can share resources across across individuals. So if you had one individual that was shaded out and another that wasn't, it might not be as effective as if you're dealing with just truly isolated individuals, as in the case of buckthorn. But in general, the expectation is, yes, you would expect to have some generalized reduction in invasion associated with these treatments.
And can you address the density of your plantings? So like a planting rate for the shrubs, spacing?
Yeah, so we really hit it with a sledgehammer on our planting densities. So the idea here was to test, if this would even work, because it wasn't clear that it would. So we used really intense plantings. They were spaced 20 to 24 centimeters apart. And so that is probably not practical for most people in larger areas or larger settings. But the good news is that our plantings were planted so densely that they self-thin. So some of the trees or shrubs didn't last very long because of competition with their partners. And so that suggests that a lower planting density would likely be equally effective. And so right now we're going through a process of testing different planting densities to see what is kind of that optimal level. We could probably get away with a far lower density that's much more palatable from a budgetary standpoint, and have the same impact.
And Nicholas, I'm going to go back to you, following up on forestry mowing again. Have you any experience with doing repeated forestry mowing, and would that even be practical?
Well, to be honest with you, it's a good question, that Telahi Woods piece. Because of a swap in land ownership between St. Cloud State and the city of St. Cloud, that actually got forestry mowed twice, because in between they were not able to do the follow-up herbicide treatment I had hoped they would have, or at least they made the decision not to. So they ended up having to go in there and forestry mow the whole thing again. So we know what the end result was. Resprouts still continuing to be present.
Okay.
It didn't do the trick. Mechanical mowing in and of itself, without some kind of herbicide, or is probably not going to be enough. Even grazing, with the grazing project we got going on this year at Christopher Kurilla, I really don't know if it's enough long term to keep buckthorn at bay without incorporating some type of herbicide, be it a spot spray or even the stump treatments.
Another question on our list of many questions. This is to Michael. So the species that were on your list are rather shade tolerant species, but a lot of the habitats that are invaded by buckthorn are, dominated by light or shade intolerant species such as oak. So have you tested your process in plant communities that are shade intolerant? And then how does that affect regeneration and ground layer development in those types of systems?
Yeah, that's a really, really fantastic question. So, we've done these experiments in a variety of sites, and those have a variety of canopy types. So it's not exclusively oak forests, although oaks are certainly a consistent theme in the sites that we see. And so our results are generalizable across a diversity of sites in that way. As far as what the canopy means for the understory, yes, like when we see, like one of the reasons why buckthorn invades those oak forests is because of the phenology component, the leaf component, about when oaks have their leaves out and when they allow light to pass through down to the buckthorn. And so we see that those higher light environments often have higher rates of volunteer regeneration. So, like clearweed or hog peanut or like snake root might pop up, thistles, nettles, they go wild when we open up the canopy like that. And so there's an additional component of dealing with that vegetation when introducing the revegetation treatment. But we also see that the larger plants that we put in do even better in those sites. So, the maples and the firs and the shrubs all do better when we're talking about lighter sites. There's, it can get too bright for sugar maple, but in general, the other plants that we put in there all do better in those lighter environments as well.
Would you ultimately be pushing the system to a plant community that is not appropriate for that site then, though?
Oh, yeah.
Is that a concern?
Yeah, so it depends on your definition of appropriate, right? Like if you have an oak forest and you want to be an oak forest, and I'm not planting oaks, that may not be palatable for you. You may want to pursue a different management approach. But if your priority is to keep buckthorn out, keep invasives out, there may be a compromise there. You may have to, our work may suggest that you may not be able to have the ideal species composition that you want if your priority is to keep those invasions down. So yeah, there's a trade-off, certainly.
Great. And Nicholas, I'm going to throw this one to you. Do you have any experience with how the buckthorn wood chippings are affecting any revegetation? And it's, I assume, spontaneous revegetation on your sites.
Well, I think, like any other woody material, it breaks down over time. If it's piled and too deep, then sure, it might be an issue. But usually when you're forestry mowing, it's really breaking down that material quite extensively, actually, if you have the right forestry mower. And
are there any allelopathic effects to your knowledge?
I'm not sure from my knowledge. I know our time is getting short, but there's one point that I did want to make unrelated to this question asked is, I'm really looking long term now. And I'm thinking, I've had this discussion internally within the DNRs. How can we help bring other tools to the tool set? And that's using volunteers, because land managers only have so many staff, and we can only contract stuff out so much before we run out of money. But if we can bring volunteers to the toolkit and have them do some of the low intensity things such as hand cutting or just follow up treatments, maybe even the small seedlings of pulling, those are things that I really would like to see utilize even more if you have a large enough volunteer base and dedicated enough to continue to focus on a specific area going beyond year 3, maybe out to year 10. I think we need to think a little bit more outside the box, and having that power of folks to get out there and do that work is really important.
I agree. I'm going to turn it back to Gina now for our wrap up, but I want to also thank you both for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you to both of our speakers, and thank you, Julia, for moderating the Q&A session. I know there are a number of questions that we didn't get to, so hopefully you'll have a chance to reach out to Michael or Nick and ask them directly. And I encourage everyone to continue to have this conversation. This is something we hear about all the time. Hopefully you can join us at our next webinar in 2 weeks. And with that, I'll let you all log off and hopefully take the survey to help us understand what more you want to learn in the future. Thank you.